My name is Jesse Miles. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow. I went to graduate school and undergrad actually at the University of Washington, and I've studied neuroscience throughout. My current work is in developmental physiology of the human brain. So I get to work with patients and with data that come directly from recordings inside the brain, near the cortex, and in structures that are deep within the brain, to learn more about how their physiology, the activity in those areas, those different parts of the brain, changes over time as people age. So looking at what those patterns look like, how they change, and how they align with changes to things like structure in the developing brain. My daily work it's pretty varied. It depends on what we need. One of the things that you do as a postdoc is kind of help run the lab. You have a principal investigator who runs things, they get funding, they work with the federal government to make sure that research that aligns with everyone's current interests is getting that funding. And so they're very busy with a lot of bigger picture type of work, but postdocs are often the people who will be doing leading the data collection and data analysis, working with principal investigators to design different research projects, doing more of the day-to-day lab research that some of the principal investigators, PIs, don't necessarily have time for. So that means for me, what I do day-to-day is some days I'll be working with patients, so I'll actually go to the hospital and do data collection with them and get to spend some time and hear about what they've been up to and what they've been doing and how that relates to our work. I do a lot of data projects where I'm analyzing data, coming up with different plans for analyses, and reading the research to see what the state of the art is for how people are thinking about the questions that we're trying to answer. I do a lot of reading, trying to make sure that the way that we're approaching problems is in line with what the current thinking in the field is and how it relates to other fields that are similar to what we do. And when I have time and the ability, also mentor other students who are either graduate students, undergrads, interns who are in the lab, so that we can have help and start training the next generation of scientists as well. I think what's interesting about neuroscience being a relatively new field is that it hasn't developed necessarily into strong subdisciplines that have pretty clear boundaries. And what that means is you benefit a lot, and this is I'm sure true in other fields as well, but in neuroscience it seems very obvious to me that you benefit a lot from having quite a breadth of knowledge and not just specializing in something. And so that can make the prioritization a little bit tricky because there's a lot that you always want to learn, and especially as scientists, we're curious people, right? So we want to really expand on what we know and make sure that we know it well enough to work with that information in effective ways. But working in both developmental neurophysiology and coming from a background in model systems and now working with people, the prioritization is key to really try and make sure that you're spending your time wisely. I would say what I try and do is think about the big picture first. What are the guiding questions that we have? What specifically do we want to know for putting in grant applications? What are the things that are being offered, the awards that are being offered, and the funding opportunities looking for? And so that guides a lot of our questions. And so prioritizing our work so that we can make sure that we're doing our due diligence to answer those is a big part of that process. And then I also like to prioritize based on what I know I'm good at and what I'm comfortable with. So if there are things that I know will be a little bit easier for me, maybe it's an analysis question or something like that, that I can work through pretty quickly, I might save that for a time when I'm on a bit more of a time crunch because I've been trying to learn a bunch of stuff from papers that have recently come out or something like that in a field that I'm not as familiar with. when you have so much that you're trying to work through. But that's one of the things that mentors are really great for, is especially people who have made it to the position of PI. The principal investigators have had to build these skills for a while throughout their training, and so yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more about and strengthening my skill set with as I still continue through the mentoring process. It's a big question. Yeah, it's a very good question. I would say it's something that I think a lot of us are really trying to spend our whole career learning how to do in a lot of ways. I think what a lot of it boils down to is knowing what would count as evidence for a question that you have. You spend so much time in conversation with other scientists and in conversation with these different literatures that you start to see, or at least hopefully, you start to see some patterns in the ways that other people in your field have been talking about their work and what they've learned from that work. And you oftentimes start by trying to replicate some of these things that are taken as known. And if you can do that and you can get on the same page as some other researchers, then these next step questions become clearer, you become familiar with the way that people are answering them, and you become familiar with the tool sets and the norms of the field that you're working within. And so there's a lot of practice in terms of building your skill sets and learning analyses and learning, the computational elements that can actually derive things from data, take these measurements that we make and turn them into sort of more meaningful units of information. And then there's also that element of training and reading and learning, where you learn more about how to map that information into a concept or something that people have a more intuitive or familiar grasp with, the actual questions that you're really trying to grapple with. And it's very complicated. It's hard to make that mapping, and I think that's why some of this training takes so long, is because it just is difficult to go through that entire process. Psychophysiology and Behavioral Systems Lab that's run by Sarah Jane Webb at the Seattle Children's Research Institute. One of the main focuses of that lab, which has over its time been pretty wide-ranging in some of the things that they've looked at, but one of the main focuses is on the neurophysiology of neurodevelopmental disorders and looking at trying to find things like neural patterns, or they're often called biomarkers, that are associated with different types of developmental delays or disorders, or just differences in general. The GRID Lab, on the other hand, which is run by Dr. Jeff Ogeman at Seattle Children's Hospital and Harborview and UW and his many affiliations that he has. They work with, as I was mentioning earlier, intracranial data, recordings that are from either cortical or subcortical, like deep in the brain, structures and right next to the tissue. And so there's this common ground between them in that they're both looking at a similar type of signal, these physiological signals, measures of neural activity, and often the ways that they're analyzed and thought about are very similar, but they have these sort of complementary elements in that there's been a lot more focus in the PBS lab on participant background and what makes their study populations distinct, and how those questions inform their research through like a developmental perspective. And the GRID Lab has worked in the past largely, not entirely, but largely in adults, where they've been asking more straightforward, I don't want to say straightforward, but more questions that are more tailored towards motor and cognitive capabilities, and the different transformations within the nervous system that allow for those things to happen. It's been an interesting but really rewarding learning experience to try and see where there are different strengths that each lab has to offer and try and kind of unite them across the different labs to try and build that collaboration. And sometimes that means working with other experts that are within the lab, or sometimes outside of the lab. We hope with some of these projects that we can start developing external collaborations, and there are certainly excellent examples of that in both labs from previous work. So as we kind of build this pediatric developmental neurophysiology program that is the collaboration between the two, hopefully that'll give us an opportunity to expand out as well, because like you said, collaborations are key. These are complicated experiments, these are complicated questions, and the more eyes that we have looking at them from many different perspectives, the better suited we'll be to try and get meaningful answers. I've been mentoring students honestly since I started, even in undergrad. Anytime someone comes in, one of the things that you want to try and do is become really skilled at something, so that you feel like you have something to offer in the lab. At least that was the approach that I took. And so even from early on, I remember in my undergrad lab, I got really good at the dissections that we were doing. And so I would learn how to do those, became kind of the person in the lab, not the only one doing them, but became the one that people would ask for advice, or how are you doing it like that, whatever it may have been. And so being able to train up new people is always kind of just a fun and rewarding thing that I think was instilled in me early on in my experience in science. But yeah, even so recently, my transition from Ph.D. work into postdoc work, I got to work with a very talented undergraduate student who's now applying to grad schools, who is leading a paper based on some analyses and data that we had collected and worked on together, which was just sent in for review, and it's a very rewarding experience to see what that final product looks like and know how hard they'd worked on it, and just it's a nice kind of feeling of pride to see someone develop alongside your own development, especially at my stage. But being a mentee is also great because there's so many people that you can go to with questions who are the best at what they do most of the and sometimes in the world, or at least locally, and being able to get their perspectives and learn their experience. It makes it clear how this sort of chain of mentorship just spans really the whole length of a career. You're almost never in a position where you're not mentoring and being mentored in some way, shape, or form, especially as scientists who often will want to look outside their field to do research, and so they're learning from even if it's a peer, someone who's more experienced than they might be. And I think it makes for, when you're able to do that well and make it a big part of your training and experience, I think it makes for a much more community-based feel and approach to the work that you do, and that can be very rewarding. There's this idea, I think, that's very pervasive in science, that you should get a very diverse breadth of training. And so I feel like in some ways, I particularly, having spent all of my career in Seattle, am a bit of an outlier. So many of the scientists that I work with, they're citizens of the world. They've trained and traveled and been in labs, either throughout the country or across countries and on different continents. I mean, it's pretty remarkable the breadth of experience that people often will get during their scientific training. What is great about being in Seattle, and what is somewhat unique, at least in my understanding, for neuroscience specifically, is that there are over 100 neuroscientists in the area. I mean, we're probably closer to 200 at this point, if not more. And so you can get this excellent background and a really diverse background in terms of mentorship and training just by being here. And so that's been, I think, really impactful for me, because I've had the opportunity to work in academic settings, in industry settings, and in very different sizes of labs, in labs whose have different ideas about how they think about funding, and how they think about collaboration. And so I've gotten to see firsthand a lot of different approaches to science, which I think that can be very valuable coming up as a trainee. In terms of challenges, I think and how I've approached them, one thing that is a benefit and sometimes a curse is being a first-gen college student and scientist, because I don't know what to expect most of the time, or I haven't come in with a lot of these ideas about how you're supposed to run a lab or how you're supposed to be in certain academic settings or research settings. I think that can work to my benefit because not coming in with a lot of expectations can be somewhat freeing in terms of how you operate, but it can also mean that you don't necessarily know a lot about what other people's expectations of you are and how most people will tend to operate. And so there's certain things that you may just either not pick up on or not know that other people take for granted. But I think navigating those challenges comes down to, in my experience, just being open with your mentors about what it is you do and don't know. And because they're there, and a big part of why they are mentors is because they want to help. They want to train you, they want to see you succeed. Being able to work with them as mentors and collaborators, and making sure that you're upfront with what your abilities are, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and what you need training in, or what you need some help in understanding, I think is a good way to navigate when things get challenging. One of the things that you also learn in science very quickly is that failure is kind of an expectation, right? These like I was saying, these things are hard, these questions are difficult. And so I think becoming comfortable with that and with the uncertainty that is just kind of baked into the whole process early on is something that helps build resilience to make it through these different transitions when you know maybe what you're working on is going to change it, so your scientific focus or what your role might be is going to change, and if you're not exactly familiar with what that role is, it teaches you how to navigate that uncertainty. But yeah, it can be difficult, as I think we're all aware, even just in terms of when you're learning the basics, right? Understanding what we can take as more established fact, for lack of a better word, what is sort of tentative in terms of the things that we're learning. Research, and I had no idea what academic research looked like. I had applied to Dr. Marty Bosma's lab, who is in the biology department and runs the undergraduate neuroscience program now, the neurobiology program. She was very, very kind when she interviewed me and realized that I really didn't know what I was doing or what I was talking about for the most part. But she had seen that I had done some research, I had read the papers, I could remember some of the more important aspects of them, and I think was willing to give me a shot based on the clear effort and interest that I had. It obviously worked out very well for me. So yeah, she was an incredible mentor. I think mentorship to Marty was a very big deal, and you could definitely see in the way that she formed relationships with all of her trainees and with her students that she had too in classes even. And so yeah, she has, and when I'm lucky, continues to be a great mentor even to this day, someone who I can reach out to. And then in graduate school, I was fortunate enough to be co-mentored for my thesis work. And so I worked in the psychology department with Dr. Sherry Mizumuri and Dr. David Geyer, and they were a really great mentoring team because they both had very different approaches, I would say, to mentorship, and things that different strengths that I could build off of. Sherry was always very open about the non-scientific side of academics and research. I mean, of course, along with the scientific side, she's an expert in her field and a wonderful person to learn from. But yeah, having that mentorship extend into just thinking about what it's like to be at a university, and really, having in-depth conversations about the whole process of the scientific enterprise along with the research went a very long way. And David was a great mentor because he was always someone who was really looking to work within what he knew as an expert, but with other people who could kind of challenge him to move in different directions. And that was one of the reasons why I think the mentorship worked so well, is that David was able to work with Sherry in a field that he was not necessarily trained in, but was learning rapidly about, and then he and I could kind of learn together. And he was an expert in his own field in sensory, especially olfactory systems and behavior. And so being able to learn from him what it meant to really try and form these multidisciplinary collaborations was, I think, really key, especially in helping me to navigate my current situation working across different labs. I think one of the things that working in gray matters we were always very aware of from the beginning was that we really thought scientists should probably be spending a little bit more time than they currently were, and we were not the first people to think this, but in trying to engage with the public, at least as like essentially interpreters. I think it's necessary and good and fine to write academic articles in the way that they're written, which was not a view that I necessarily always held, but to a certain extent they have to be extremely specific. The language that they use, it falls within a field that has a very, very clear and specific understanding of what is being said, what is being studied, what is being analyzed, and sometimes that means use of jargon that you might otherwise not use and agree with. But that shouldn't be where the dialogue stops, I think, is what we really were interested in with gray matters. And one thing that I'm trying to incorporate into my practice as a scientist is take what you know and however you have presented it, but then figure out ways to translate that into something that others can at least take some kernel out of knowledge or of interest, to be able to make something out of. And it can be very difficult, especially because you learn throughout your training that you do want to be extremely specific and precise with your language. And when you feel like you have to sacrifice some of that, or not sacrifice, but when you feel like you have to forego some of that specificity for understandability or for broad communication, it can be challenging. But I don't think that's a good reason not to do it. We've all gone as scientists through very, very rigorous and challenging training, and so I think that just needs to become more of a part of it. And that was one thing that we really wanted Gray Matters to be, is an opportunity for developing scientists at the earliest stages of their career in a lot of cases, to learn some of those skills about communication and about the process of translating science to a broader public. Yeah, I would have to say I am not at the place yet where I'm doing that to the degree that I would like to, but I'm well aware that is something it's certainly an expectation that I have for myself and would like to see it adopted much more broadly within the scientific community. Yeah, well, the whole idea for Gray Matters was from Kayla Ritchie, who had worked in, I think, Boston University at a similar publication called The Nerve. And we just wanted essentially to have maybe like a blog or something where the whole premise was just let's try and teach people a little bit more about neuroscience, or not even teach, just write about it, hopefully in a way that gets out to more people and is a little bit more engaging. And that, I think, quickly grew, or not grew, but what we realized very early on was that the best way to do that was to work with people who had a really broad set of expertise, right? People who were not just communicating science and who were not just trying to act as those translators of scientific paper into scientific communication, science communication, but work with artists, work with designers, work with people who knew how to market, work with people who could do web design, people like yourselves who were interested in this larger enterprise that was not just going to be a couple of geeks writing a blog that no one saw because it wasn't very interesting, or even if the writing was maybe fine or even good, just didn't have a broader appeal. And so we brought on, even from the first meeting, there were people in the art department who were there with us. There were people from a bunch of different majors within the sciences. We had someone who was also in business school, or like a double major in neuroscience, neurobiology, and in business, who was there with us. So from the beginning, I think that maybe was just sheer luck, but it became a real focus of ours to maintain that diversity of educational backgrounds and experiences. And I think that's honestly what served us well. That's why we were able to work, is because we would take, even just a mock-up of an article, or when we finally were able to get it put together, the first issue that we printed out to different people around the university, and they would see it and they would go, whoa, I mean, this isn't really what we were expecting. We certainly don't want to discredit what UW students can do, but I think they thought that we were, it's going to be putting some stuff together in a Word document and then making a little zine or something, and it was a legitimate looking publication. And so having the design, having the art students, having people who were able to explore those interests as rigorously and as seriously as we explored that translating science aspect of it, was really what we decided to focus on and decided to use as our platform to really start our growth from. In the beginning, there were a lot of challenges that were probably mostly due to inexperience, honestly. I mean, a lot of us had never used any sort of publication software before, or those of us that had were more familiar with how it applied to web design, or making something in print was not really, even back then, it was already, the transition was well underway to online. And so we spent a lot of time just figuring out on forums and with some gracious folks from the design school who would offer up an hour here and there, or let us come to their office hours even, how to lay out an article, or how to put everything that we had made in these sort of disparate pieces together. And so that was certainly a big challenge, was just this sort of ignorance that we had. But I think, we were all students and we were all very busy. Especially a lot of the people who had been there from the beginning were double majors. They were either going to be seniors, or they either were seniors or were going to be seniors, and so there was this big turnover even in the first year. Because we were so focused on trying to get our first issue out, we didn't focus as much initially on trying to fundraise, and we didn't focus as much initially on trying to grow Gray Matters. And so it took so much of our energy to just get that first issue out that we didn't really focus on what it would be like in the future. And so, a couple of us really had to just figure out how to get that first issue done, print a couple copies, take it to some departments and people whose names we had heard before, or blind email some folks who we knew were important but maybe didn't know how important they actually were, and through their just goodwill and interest, that allowed us to become an actual RSO, have a sponsor, print copies, have widespread interest on campus from the student population so that we could continue bringing people in, and start the whole mentorship side of Gray Matters and training in science writing and science communication, which allowed us to have more longevity because we could bring on freshmen and sophomores and people who were really just starting and help them develop from kind of their their ground up in their college experience. And so that helped us a lot too. One of the things that has served us well was baking this whole idea of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work into the mission statement of Gray Matters, and having a dual mission of, from the very beginning, trying to train people in science communication. Having those as like explicit goals and explicit guiding principles was important to us early on, and it seems luckily for us to have been important to the people who have taken the reins ever since. We've gone through, or the Gray Matters has gone through, obviously, many generations of leadership teams at this point. And it's been very heartening, I think, for me personally, to see those aspects of the mission still carried on. So I think we really just kind of, in some ways, lucked out on noticing that those were going to help us succeed from these early days. Yeah, it's just having those be explicit parts of the mission have been pretty key, instead of things that we maybe talk about but don't always live behind. The other thing I think that makes Gray Matters so successful is that there is such a vibrant community, like many different vibrant communities at UW. Students are very interested, I think, in learning outside of their niche, right? So you can take an art student who has much different academic interests than how a neuron works, tell them a little bit about how a neuron works, and then they'll give you some beautiful diagram or some beautiful artistic expression of some neuroscientific concept, just because they're curious. And they're very skilled at what they do. And so having people, I think, or working with people and drawing from this pool of very excited and interested and just curious students at the university definitely has gone a long way towards the success of Gray Matters. The way that Gray Matters impacts the wider community, especially outside of academics, is sort of for the community to say. And I have a pretty biased view of it, being now as someone who's more deeply entrenched in the scientific community. But I guess I can give some examples. I remember how delighted sometimes my family would be when I would send them an issue, and they're like, "Oh, I actually really can understand a lot more about what you do now," or like, what some of the stuff is that you're studying or talking about. And so being able to see firsthand what it was like for people who had never gone to college, or who were, just less familiar with some of the work that was being done in lab spaces or in academia, seeing how they would react and seeing how they would really start to take in to sometimes a much greater degree what that information was than, for example, when I would explain more specifically what I was doing to them. I think it was very eye-opening that we were starting to accomplish our mission. But I think part of the testament to, or a big testament to why Gray Matters, whether Gray Matters has started to accomplish its mission, is the fact that you all are still around and that you continue to do what you do, and you continue to grow, and you continue to deliver on that mission and expand it in new ways with every iteration of leadership, and with everyone's new ideas that are running Gray Matters. And so that's been extremely cool to see. I'm glad it's been so dynamic, and it's not something that has just stayed the same from when we had the idea to start it, but has really taken on new directions and new focuses, and been able to expand to different universities. And to collaborate. Make sure that you get help from a lot of different people. You know, it doesn't have to be everyone you know or anything like that, but make sure that the people who you do work with are not just people who are going to see everything the same way that you do, or not just people who are going to make sure they're people who are going to challenge you, and make sure they're people who are going to, who you can work together with, but who you can work together with through potential conflict and through at least differences in opinion and how things maybe should run. And make sure that you can be comfortable with not always being the expert. That was, I think, huge in what we were doing initially, is that sometimes you just had to trust someone, even though it was not something you really understood, right? Like if someone is like, no, this is a way better way to design this layout, and I'm looking at it like, I don't understand, I feel like, you know, we should do this, but they're, you know, coming from a place of you know, just a better background or a better position to be able to make that call. You just have to give in every once in a while. Yeah, the other advice is definitely don't focus, like, I know it's science outreach, but you can't just focus on the science, right? You can't just be so caught up in being, you know, some genius about how the brain works, right? That's not gonna do it for you. That's why we're in some of the problems that we're in with science communication, is because we have experts writing for other experts, and it's maybe good for how science is done, but it's not good for how the public understands what we do. It's very obviously not, considering, you know, how little trust there has been lately in scientific institutions. So yeah, that's a problem that you can't ignore if you're going to try and do outreach. In fact, that's hopefully something that outreach is really trying to remedy. And I think bringing experts into that space is really important, and should hopefully be something that both the outreach, people doing outreach, and people doing the work themselves can kind of unite on, to have a stronger front to help rebuild trust in science and in the things that scientists are saying and doing. Part of when I was in grad school, the lab that I worked in, Dr. Rosman's lab, was part of the Disabilities and Opportunities in Information and Technology program, the Do It program at UW. And the whole goal of that program was to bring folks with disabilities who are underrepresented in academia and in science into labs, to work with them and show them what we do, and, you know, hopefully get them interested in participating in science and joining labs and finding ways for them to either integrate into the labs themselves that were a part of the program, or connecting them with other labs that might be more aligned with their specific disabilities. And I'll never forget a conversation that I was watching and having with some of the people who I had worked with, who I was working with. Both of the students, or the scholars that were in the lab, had hearing disabilities, and one of them was there because they were really interested in advancing cochlear implant technology to help, you know, them and their community hear in ways that, you know, they just didn't currently have access to. But another one who they were having this conversation with, this other person, was very firmly opposed, or not opposed, but ambivalent about that aspect of science. You know, they were not interested in neuroscience and had very little interest in trying to change accessibility in that way through technology, for them personally at least. But they were interested in making much more accessible, baking accessibility into other aspects of how society operated. You know, having interpreters be something that was just a given instead of something that you had to ask for accommodation for. Things like that was much more what they had seen as something to focus on. I like to spend a lot of time with music. whether it's playing music. I'm not a particularly skilled instrumentalist, but I can usually mess around if someone gives me an instrument and have a good time with it. So I've played drums, guitar, trumpet, banjo with folks in the past, just for fun. Never particularly skilled. So that aspect of it, going to shows and concerts, and so seeing live music, and I think in the past few years, especially, also trying to build more of a music collection, collecting records, and things like that are a lot of fun, and just learning a little bit more about some of the history and some of the more detailed like sociological aspects of different how different genres came to be or interact with each other, and just kind of tracing that lineage is really fun for me. But aside from that, one of the nice things about having been in the Pacific Northwest for so long is that I have a community outside of science who I can spend a lot of my time with, which is very refreshing. Most of my closest friends are either very peripherally involved in research or have very different careers in general. And so being able to see them and work with them and hear more about what other life paths lead to is a lot of fun for me, and definitely I think helps to keep my head out of the ivory tower, as it's often called. So I really appreciate the ability to have that outside of my work.